Okay, it's go time. Hello, Marilyn. How you doing? Welcome, everybody, to Late Night Live number 13. 13. Can't believe I've been doing this for 13 weeks already. Hello, hello. Hey, Catherine. Hey, Radika. What up, Ruth? Whoa, we got a whole bunch of people in here today. Or there's a whole bunch of people chatting, which is fun. As always, I'm going to ask, is the sound okay? Music level, microphone level, all that stuff. Today should be a fun one. Today's a little more structured. Last week was all kinds of craziness and ridiculous fun. This week we're gonna a little more serious. The crazy is fun. I mean, so do I. That's what's going on, Otiswini. That's sort of what these lives started as. They were just me being silly and whatever I happen to be doing at night. Hello, little Missy. Thank you for the subscribe. Yeah, get ready to do some writing. If you don't feel like writing, you don't have to. This isn't actually a class. This is just me doing what I would, I guess, do in a class. I've had a lot of people asking lately for some specific capital letter breakdowns and questions about capital letters, so I figured I would just do a live specifically geared to that. So I don't have a specific plan that I'm following. The suggestions and whatnot are going to come from the chat. But yeah, I figured, yeah, a little more structured than last week. I am writing with a brand new jar of McCaffrey's ink today. Hopefully it works nicely for me. I finally decanted that giant, I can't even call it jar, giant bottle of ink that I had just a few minutes ago. Hello, hello. Please have some beautiful form variations for the E. All right, sounds good. We can start with the capital letter E then. Still gonna wait just a couple more minutes here before I dive in. I should probably do some warming up. I mean, I did a little bit when I wrote that, but that doesn't really count as a warm-up. All right. I, L, and how to make smooth, not sharp tops. Okay. You're going to have to remind me about that one because I'm going to start with the E. And I won't be scrolling. It's not going to all happen like in order where people ask questions. It's the first one that I saw was E, so we're going to start with that one. And then when that one's done, I will go back to the chat and ask for the next one. So I will try to remember some of them if people suggest them and or ask and I see them, but I will likely forget a lot of the questions that come up. All right, I can answer that question, Moosh. Hope that's pronounced right. How to get smooth movements for your drills. I actually have another live. If you check out, it was a few weeks ago where I did an entire live all night of just movement drills. It was just oval drills geared towards business penmanship, which is based, I mean, same movement that we use for ornamental penmanship. So I would highly suggest checking out that live. There's a lot of chatter that happens in between the in between the actual drilling and whatnot, but I would recommend checking out that live because that's all about movement with the metronome of death. We right, I forgot that we used the metronome for that one. No metronome today. I only use the metronome primarily when I teach and when I'm by the book doing some training. But let's get into it. So, starting off, the first question was some beautiful form variations of the capital E. So, we're going to start by just breaking down the capital E. I'm trying to decide if I should do this in pencil or if I should do it in pen. I'll do it in pen. The metronome's fun. I mean, I also really like using the metronome. I don't use it when I'm practicing most of the time just because I feel like there's kind of a permanent metronome going on in my head because I'm a dance teacher and whatnot. That's a standard thing. All right, so for the capital E, I always start my capital E with a horizontal entry oval. I can't say always. I normally, when I started my capital E with a horizontal entry oval. And that was like so. Then when I get to this point, you're now transitioning from a horizontal oval to go up. Now you have this, if you imagine like a large oval right here. I'm coming up to meet the top of that and then cutting that, whoa, in two. Wow, this paper is not good for writing slowly. And then my shade happens basically from here to there. And this is about that oval, like so, the big large oval that we then cutting off this side of it. The one thing, you don't have to start with this horizontal entry oval. This could start, if you wanted an entry oval, it could start a little bit higher and go to there. Or you could start straight up here and go straight into that one. Or you could do a little loop here into that first one. I personally really like my entries to bisect that little slant that's at the opposite of the 48-degree slant line. Today I'm writing at 48 degrees. This paper might be a little too snaggy. I might have to go to a different paper after this one, but we'll give it a shot. So let me write an E real quick, and then we will do a little bit more of a breakdown on it. Oh, come on. Snag City, what's going on here? I'm gonna go, I think my nib's a little old. I'm gonna grab a smoother piece of paper that I just so happen to have right behind me. Hello, Fozzie. Oh yeah, the kids are at school. Is it lunch break right now? Okay, back to that E with hopefully less snags. I don't know where my loop is, so I can't actually check out my my nib that well today. Come on. Well, that's not a good way to start a live, Mike. Okay. So, I like to get the length. One of the questions I get the most, and this will go through a lot of our letters throughout the evening. People always ask me, how long should this entry oval be, or how big should it be? I personally think about it approximately. It's never like a concrete thing, but approximately the size of an oval that you'd have for like an O. All right, this nib. I can't even write slowly without it snagging. Something's wrong here. I'll talk while I try to get a new nib. Is this one good? Fingers crossed. I try to keep it approximately the size of what an O would be, depending on the size of your capital letters. Fingers crossed. This fixed the issue. Sorry, everybody. I don't even know if this nib is prepped. Mike wasn't ready today. Is it prepped? Yeah. Okay, yeah, so about the size of a standard oval that is going from top to bottom. Like I said, it doesn't have to be the exact same, but that's about a good gauge. And then that follows through as well for your exit oval. I would want my exit oval to be approximately the same size as this one. Now, they're very rarely exactly the same size, but that's just sort of my my challenge. I like to get this little loop in here, and I like that entry oval when it comes down to cut right in there to bisect that entry oval. So if I were to write one slowly, I have my entry oval. Again, approximately the size of that oval. I now transition from horizontal to 48-degree slant line, so on an angle. So this is my transition stroke. And now I come down, tiny little loop, add my shade, and come below. That's probably a little bit too far below the baseline, but ideally, you want your baseline to be right in the middle of that oval, half and half. Now, like I said, you don't have to start with a horizontal entry oval if you don't want to. I lately have been starting my E's just with a single line. Coming from here. Like so, and then I add... It's funny, I've never been a huge fan of the dagger. I know some penmen really, really like them. Some penmen don't really like them. I've never been a huge fan until relatively recently. I've started adding them to... I mean, I really only use it on the E, but I've started using it all the time on the E. 6 a.m. Holy. Dedication coming out of Berlin. Oh, Berlin. This is the first year, I think, in 5 years that I didn't go to Berlin. Is that true? Oh, that's sad. The first year in 5 years that I won't be in Berlin. Sad story. Okay. So let's write those. All right, so we have our standard one. You already saw me write that one. Our second variation here, like so. And you can put that dagger, you don't have to. Another variation that I've been a big fan of recently, this is one that E.W. Blozer used a lot, especially in his signature. Starting with a horizontal entry oval, and he goes way over with a compound curve, and then from here, going up and around. So once we get to this point here where this one started, they're all pretty much the exact same. Even the first one we did, we come up, this is the same on pretty much all of them, once we hit that point on our first downstroke. So for this one, we have our entry oval, compound curve up and around, and that can be... Sometimes they did them quite small, and sometimes they did them way over, that they hovered over an entire signature. So then from there, we have our next stroke, which I didn't have any ink come out of my pen at all. Like so. Now, ideally, you can see this is a little tight in there. Ideally, I would like that to be a little bit more of an oval. More similar to like what we have going on there. Opposite of the slant line. I don't remember what that angle is. If I write at 48 degrees, what is the opposite angle of 48 degrees? Somebody put that in the chat. Let me know. Yeah, no more Christmas in Berlin. Hopefully next year. Fingers crossed. It's not the same. Yeah, but what's the perpendicular angle? What is the number? Not the name. I know it's 85. 85? 48, 85? All right. 132? Well, oh. We got 2 for 132. We got a 42. Okay, you guys are coming up with all different numbers here. This angle right here is what we're hunting for. It doesn't really matter. We don't need that angle, but whatever makes a 90-degree angle to 48 degrees. Okay. So like I said, that variation could be done quite small as well. Oh, rookie mistake. My computer's totally not plugged in. You'd think I never did this before. Give me 2 seconds. Oh, this part. The most important part ever. Streaming is rough on the computer, and I didn't plug it in. I blame you for this, Pylon. The Pylon is in a bad mood this week. He had a bit of a spill when I was unpacking boxes. A stack of shoe boxes right on the traffic cone and knocked him off of the cutting table onto the floor, and he exploded. It was a very dramatic affair. I don't know if you guys can still hear me. Yeah, it was pretty intense. Oh, but I put them back together. It took some time, but still some pieces are missing. One of the arms of his glasses is somewhere in my apartment. I do not know where. No other capitals yet in the pipeline. I think I'm going to go to the capital I next. I think that was the second suggestion. One of the biggest issues that people have with the capital E, myself included, is this shade. You'll notice oftentimes this shade almost starts on its way up. As we're coming down here, the shade starts right there. So it almost sometimes is going up before it goes down, which is very difficult unless you have either a lot of speed. If you're going nice and quick, you can get that shade started on the way up. If you're going slow, again, there's nothing wrong with writing slowly, but if you're going slowly, this is where you're going to want to have a little bit of that pen rotation. So when you're coming down, you get to here, you want to rotate your pen a little bit. Whoa, that's way too far to the left. But so you can get that shade in, if that makes sense. Another thing that can kind of help as you set up for an E, if you've been in my lives before, you've heard me talk about the slight change of the elbow placement. If I'm going to be doing a letter like an E that I know has a shade on a direct oval, I'm going to tuck my elbow in just a little bit closer to my body. Not enough that it restricts movement, but just a little bit, because you'll notice what that does to the angle of my nib. If I'm sitting here like this is my normal, natural, we got 90 degrees here. This is, we'll call this neutral position. If I tuck my elbow in just a little bit, it's going to change the angle of that nib ever so slightly, which is going to help me get that shade a little bit smoother. Now that's something I don't do too often, but every once in a while, or I don't do it all the time. It's not really a conscious choice, but when I got that going to that eye shade, it's easier than if I was this way, because then you're going directly against the way the nib wants to push. I rotate a little bit in this way, so I use that with my quick movement. If you're writing slowly, I don't think you have to worry about the elbow placement. Just be in a comfortable position, and you can give yourself a little bit of pen point manipulation or pen rotation. So that is the E. And with any of those entry strokes, like any letter, these ovals can continue. So you can start the E with a full oval. Yeah, lots of possibilities. Again, and also you can end the E with a flourish as well. that can continue going. As long as the main form and structure of that standard E, basically like this one here that has no extra anything minus the dagger, as long as that still is apparent, everything else that around it is just then ornamentation. But if the ornamentation gets in the way of this being the proper form, then that's where we come into issue. So our base form is super important. All right, so that's the capital E. If anybody has any other questions on the E, these breakdowns may or may not be super in-depth the entire time. If you guys have questions or if there's something I said that doesn't make sense, please feel free to ask and I can elaborate a little more. Or if I move on and you think, oh, I had that thing about the E and I forgot to ask it, shoot it in the comments and I can try to answer it for you. All right, so the capital I. Please explain the I. So the I is a letter that I always considered a backwards letter. It's not technically backwards, but always when I first started penmanship, in my brain it was like the I feels backwards because it starts going with an upstroke with an indirect oval. So it always felt backwards to me. It starts, if this is our baseline here. This nib is not being very starty. Come on. We're going in an indirect oval from below the baseline. We come up here. Now, unlike the O that we had, when we get up to this point and we hit about just past the top of our letter form, we're going to transition to come straight down on the 48-degree slant line. Traditional Spencerian, 52 degrees. I personally tend to write on 48, so that's what we're writing on today. I pretend I maybe should have done this at 32 today, but it's all the same, just a slightly different angle. So I transition to a straight line and come down here. And then that goes into my shade. And if I'm doing this slowly, I'm going to rotate my nib a little bit to get that nice smooth shade in there. And from there, it can finish there, or we finish with a horizontal exit oval. So again, that's an implied oval that's sort of bisected by the baseline. So that little transition, this is the part that I would say gets most people. Getting that transition from nice and round to sharp without, I mean, obviously we could always have it stop up there, but we don't want a sharp point. We want it to be a rounded point. It's like a very large version of when we do our lowercase letters. And we have that almost sharp, but not quite, turns. Like they're not sharp angles, they're slightly rounded. This is just in much larger form. I have a bad habit of getting nib snags right off the bat with with the capital I. And one thing that I think causes that, if you start the I tend to start the I on the bottom of the oval, right here, as I'm coming around, rather than starting it right at the baseline, because at the baseline, I'm already in a push stroke. So I'm already going up right against. So when I drop to where I think the level of the paper is, it's really easy to all of a sudden get a nib snap. Whereas if I start over here, I have, granted it's not a lot of space, but I have a little bit of side motion. And when I have that side motion, that transitions me from side into that push stroke. So it lessens the chance of getting a snap ever so slightly if you're writing with speed. Hello, Bernice. Good morning. All right, so the I. So we start below the baseline, around and down. Here we go. So we have that nice curved beginning. We hit that transition to come down on the 48 and then curving into our slant line. That came out pretty nice. That little turn right there. I will say, if you imagine, and this may work for some people and it may not work for some people. For sure won't work for everybody, I don't imagine. But in my brain, I think of writing this form. Having a sharp point and then coming down. Yeah, so going up, not stopping, but hitting a point and coming down. And then when you do that with movement behind it, it tends to naturally round out that top corner. Because you're not actually letting yourself stop. So that's just, it's a mind trick. You know that you're not going to be stopping, but so again, we come here. No ink. Come on, nibs. That one was a little more rounded, but we still hit straight. I'm off my slant line, but you get the idea. You can also start the I the same way. We haven't done any letters that start this way yet, but we can start it with a compound curve entry stroke if you want. I don't usually do these this way unless it's part of a design and I can draw it. And that just is because doing it quickly, I have trouble spacing it out and I tend to mess it up. But what that means, if we have a compound curve here, and we hit this bottom part, now we're at the same point that we started our eyes before. Yeah, so we have compound curve, around, then we start just a standard eye that we did before. To here, like so. And that can give you a really nice cross right in the middle of this implied oval right there. That's the thing that I don't usually hit. I end up having just my ovals look like they're too close or not close enough. That I never hit that butter zone, or I rarely hit it. Yep. My nibs aren't playing friendly. These might be old nibs. I'm not fully unpacked and organized after the move yet, so what I'm writing with is just what happened to be in my pencil case. Yeah, that's the exact entry that I use for the capital J. That is true. Yep, when I do a capital J, I often start the same way. And the J is the same idea. We have that slight sharper turn. What we don't want for the I or the J is to be totally round the entire time. We really want to make sure we have that transition from curve stroke to straight down stroke on the slant line. Yeah. So that's the breakdown of the capital I. What was the other one? You wanted the L. Was the L, the question was how to not get a sharp point on the top of an L? I think was a question I saw. Could I compare an I and a J? There we go. Not sharp tops. How to make smooth, not sharp tops, consistent humps on the M. Okay. Easier said than done. First, I will go back. Somebody asked me to compare the I and the J, so I will do that. The only real difference in the I and the J is the first half of the letter is identical. If I'm coming around here, depending on my entry oval, but as I'm coming up here, I will draw this slowly. I transition to come down on my slant line. So that part, so far, we're the same when we get to about here on the I and the J. Now, if I do the I have a stem stroke, a stem shade right here that continues into my exit oval, my horizontal exit oval. If I do a J, the stem comes below the baseline. And I get my descender stroke. But the first little bit is the exact same. So I will write those two real quick. We have the I with our stem stroke. And we have the J, same start. Like so. So the turn at the top ideally is identical. And same with the entry. If this entry were to start with a compound curve, this one could as well. They start the exact same way. They're both backwards letters in my brain. All right, capital L. So, the capital L is normally started with a horizontal entry oval, basically the same size rule I would apply that we did for the capital E. We have our horizontal entry oval here. And then just like the E, when I get to this point, I start to transition from horizontal oval into angle because I need to get onto my slant line here. So I transition up. And now I go into a compound curve. I curve around. So far, we're very similar to the way we did our capital E, coming up and coming down. But instead of giving a little loop, the center of the E, we're going to go into a compound curve. Oh, my ink drying super fast. Compound curve, giving our shade after we get below the halfway point into a horizontal exit oval, like so. So my favorite S's are the, that's an S. I was supposed to be writing an L. Hey, Courtney. Thanks for popping in to say hi. From basically Barhead. Where are you right now? L, not S. So the beginning is the same, all the way to the shade. Sorry about that. Transition, we come down, compound curve. We add our shade. Now you can lift here. You can finish that compound curve and lift your pen, and then drop the pen again to do a oval, a horizontal entry oval into a compound curve, into an oval that ideally again bisects the baseline about the same size as this entry oval here. Approximately the same. Oh, a little cabin. Well, that's fun. Thanks for popping by. I personally don't like stopping there, just because I find that I can always see my transition if I start the L. I do my shade like that. I can always see when I drop my nib again to do my exit oval. I can always see what happened right there. So I like to do the whole thing all in one stroke, personally. One thing I should mention, I thought about it and now I forgot it. What was it? So I can't remember. Maybe it'll come back to me again. So there are two ways. Back in the day, I taught the L two different ways. The first, and this works for the S as well. If you have our angle line here, 48-degree slant line. If I do my entry oval Now I could come here and follow my slant line and shade from there. Which ends up giving, I don't think it's wrong, but it ends up making the L look too slanted. So what I end up doing is bringing that compound curve almost more of a vertical downstroke to go into the shade to come around, so that both of those shapes both of those implied ovals are bisected by the slant line. Yeah, the S and the L are very, very similar. I remembered what I meant to say. For your entry oval for the L, this is an opinion thing. I didn't read this anywhere. I believe that it is important that the oval is not too narrow, that it goes down low. And the reason for that, if I do an entry oval that's super shallow up here, now I have very little time to make a nice transition up and to compound curve around. It makes, again, not wrong, but it makes this transition right here rather abrupt. Whereas I like to drop that entry oval a little bit lower so that that transition from horizontal to angled oval can be a little bit smoother. That brings our our middle point down into the middle rather than higher into this shade to there, and the compound curve at the end. Personal preference thing, but I like to drop that entry oval quite a bit, or keep it wide. It's common to see it be very, very long. Yeah, so that is the L. And then the last part of that question was the sharp humps of the M. I mean, the only real way to get used to doing that, it's sort of similar to the mindset that I talked about with the capital I, how if you imagine a sharp point, but then use your movement and that will naturally round it out, that's potentially not the way for you, that's going to be best for you to learn it. That's sort of what I think about as I'm doing it. I should have better M's than I do because they're in my name. But if you do them just like you would an ascended stroke, over and over and over again to get that muscle memory to do the ascended stroke, you need to do these. And they are basically an overturn slightly into a almost straight downstroke. That's a little wider than it should be. But they're not completely, most of the time, rounded on top. They are like the standard form, like so, but just stretched out. So I would say the best way is just to get that form, just like practicing ascended strokes. I would probably do some air ovals going an indirect oval, and then over and down, and you get that straight downstroke. This is also good practice for your capital I. After doing this, you'd have a nice transition on the top of that capital I because you're practicing the slight overturn into the straight downstroke. Slight overturn into a straight downstroke. And you can stop and lift your pen after each one if you want. I don't like to stop and reset. I like to do the 2 of the M nice and quickly, cascading smaller. I think the one that ends up being sharp most of the time is this one, and that's because of the anticipation for the shade, or I would assume it's because of the anticipation for the shade. When we're getting ready for the shade, there's that slight little, I don't know if it's a bit of tensing up that happens, that coming down will end up getting a stroke like so. We'll get that sharp top because we want to add a tight little shade in there. What is the music in the background? I honestly don't know what song this is. I can't see the names of the songs. It is a not iTunes. It is a playlist from YouTube's music archive that is just playing at random. I went into the YouTube audio library and just downloaded everything, all of the chill, relaxing music, and just slapped it into a playlist. But so the key, if you do want to add a shade there, and you don't want to, what's going on, Colby? And you don't want to get that sharp top of the M, then it's getting used to, you do that first without a shade until you don't have it sharp, until they're nice and round like you want. And then you want to start that shade after, it's milliseconds basically, but right at this point here, after you make that top turn. Don't let yourself tense up and get ready for that shade until you've made that turn. And that shade just lasts for, it's literally like, pop. It just lasts for a fraction of a second. Otherwise it ends up extending too long. It is a stroke that, this is one stroke that I like the look of when I do it slow a lot better than I do when I have movement writing. If you're writing an M, and you get that beautiful little oval on the last turn. I believe it's Michael Sull that made me like this so much, because it's just so controlled. But that's very, very, very difficult to do at speed. At speed, they end up being a lot more elongated. Like so. They end up being lower and a lot longer. You can see you want to start your shade. This one started a little soon, and I do have a slightly sharp top there. You want to start your shade not till you're over that curve. But it's fractions of seconds, so it takes a lot of practice doing that stroke over and over and over again. I would recommend not exactly drilling it like I'm doing it here. If you're gonna do both of them, I would just go all the way and chuck in a horizontal exit oval on the end. Aha! Sharp. See? So then you do one, analyze, look, focus on getting that a little bit rounded out at the top of the second one, and then you keep practicing. Once you have it smooth in hairline form, then you do it with a little bit of a shade. You can create this funky little pattern drill exercise, but it's basically just that same stroke over and over and over again to get it in your body. These horizontal exit ovals are terrible today. Don't do as I do today. Do as I say. Make those ovals nicer than the ones I'm doing. Those aren't very pretty. The M stresses me out. All right, so there. That was a big question. Hopefully I answered and gave you what you were looking for. Any other questions about the M? If not, what capital letter would you guys like to go to next? Oh yeah, if you're doing weddings, I guess you got Mr. and Mrs. and yeah, there's a lot of M's. M's are I often get really nice M's because I do them in my signature and whatnot quite often, and they turn out pretty good. They're just inconsistent, unfortunately. M's are those letters that I wish I could just do slow all the time. Do. Let's see. PBR, please. Those things with the heads. Sounds good. We'll do PB and R, and then we'll do V for Nico. Okay. PB and R. All right. So the variation that I use of the P the most, the B and the R for that matter, is just a standard horizontal entry oval into a stem stroke. My desk is really noisy today. So this is the same, this entry oval, it's another one of the questions that I get the most, is how big should my entry oval be? And it's the same rule that I spoke of when we did the capital E. About the same size as an O would be. About like that. Give or take. It can be a little bit bigger or a little bit smaller. Too big or too small, and you get into the realm of artistic license and artistic choice. I like to try to keep them in that middle range. They don't really vary that much. Like the entry ovals, like so far the L, the E, and well now the P that we're gonna do first all have about approximately the same entry oval size. All right. So we have our standard stem stroke. I can see this in real life, but it's invisible on the camera. It's a little too thin. So for the P, when I do a P in this variation, I'll usually start approximately here. And I do the head of the P different than I do for the B, and I guess more similar to the R. The P and the R, I think I do a little bit closer. But I start coming up this way and just around like so. It's basically just if you imagine an implied oval here, but you're starting it, you're transitioning from here into that implied oval. So you're making a horizontal oval, but it's sort of cut off a little bit. And the reason I say imagine the larger oval is if you imagine a small one here, the likelihood is you're going to bring it around here, and it's going to be too squished. It's going to be too narrow. I like to imagine with the P specifically, because when you add a shade, it's really easy for the P to end up shaded like a stem shade, and the P shouldn't be shaded like a stem shade. It continues round. Even if the stroke ends here, the implied travel continues curving. So even, like I said, even if I go up and around and lift, the traffic is going up here. It's not going flat like a stem does. Yeah, so you really want to make sure that your ending stroke, or that you continue going up and around. I like to keep it going and hook it a little bit more so it crosses the stem, just because it forces me to continue that sort of upstroke a little bit to keep that oval end so that it's not ending flat. Do you shade it? I sometimes do, I sometimes do not. With the capital P, more often than not, I would shade the capital P. And when you shade the P, it happens approximately from there to there. Similar to how you would shade it if it was a stem stroke. If you think of how you would shade a capital Z. If we did a whole big capital Z, and we have that nice long shade, that's basically how you shade a P. The P is just a little more condensed, so it's not going to be as long vertically as you would with a Z. So that second stroke would just come from here, like that. Is approximately what we're going for. Notice how it still ends on a little bit of an upstroke. It's not going completely flat. The shade is on the thickest point is at the lower right side of the implied oval that we have created here. So that's how you do that. Not all the P's. The P's in traditional writing weren't always heavily shaded. They'd always have a standard heavy shaded stem stroke, but they would often just have more of an accent shaded top or no shade at all. Like if you got into a P with the compound curve variation, they would do like so, and it wouldn't be shaded. This should, in a perfect world, cut up a little bit like that, a little bit more, but nice heavy shade at the bottom, and that's just because of how close those two shades get to each other. And this shade lower, and it looks like it's gonna tip over. Yeah, you really wanna make sure that the shade, when it hits this lower portion and it's starting to going back up again, it needs to end tapering out. It can't finish, if the heavy point of the shade ends up being like, say here, instead of being right in the middle of that implied oval, then yeah, it's gonna look like it's gonna tip over. But I would also err on the side of making that shade narrower than you think you want to make it. Like this, it would be I would consider a very heavily shaded P. And like I said, it's basically the same as the Z, but if you compare this one to this one, it's just squished, so this shade just ends up being a little bit flatter, if that makes sense. T. All right. With variations of the P, I mean, with that entry stroke that we started with, you could start on the right side of the stem if you wanted to and come around in here. I don't usually do that because I want the P to keep going, and that makes everything look too far to the right. Normally, like the B, for example, you start the B on the right-hand side of the stem. But for the P, I like to start it over here because it keeps everything not looking like it's gonna tip over. And then you just get that upstroke, transition into your horizontal oval, shade on the bottom, and finish it traveling in an oval shape. Like, hopefully, so. Like that. So that is about the shade size. That oval is a little bit big, but that is about the shade size that I would sort of go for the top of a P. It's just an accent shade, more a product of speed than really a product of throwing or pushing in a heavy shade there. Making sure you get back to hairline before you cross through your stem shade. You can also, what I like to do quite often is a variation of the P, that second stroke. Whoa, let's get on the slant line, how about? I like to start with a little oval in here inside our stem stroke or inside our entry oval. I like to get just a little oval that fits right inside there. And then I like to compound curve out. And that can go straight into that P, like that. Or you can get even fancier with it and make that little oval compound curve go around and have your P there. One issue that comes in when you do that is if you have lowercase letters, this stroke, in order for everything to not be condensed, that has to come quite low, and it can get in the way of some of your lowercase letters that would come next. So that one at speed real quick. That's a little high. That's the idea. If you want to add a little bit snazzier stuff in there. What if you write the ascended letter form of the P? Small L. Yes. Right. What if you have to write an ascended letter form under the P? Right. So if you're writing please and you have an L that has to come next, I would definitely choose I would opt out of doing an over schnazzified P, and I would make the shade even smaller. If I knew I had an L coming next, I would do either no shade or just a slight accent shade. If, let's say, the L was coming after this one, I don't know if this is correct or not, but I would have my L live inside. That looks wrong though, but that is how I would do it. Right, let me try. Let me write please. No, I totally wouldn't. So I would just tuck it in nice and close and try to get that space to be not super big so that it looks properly spaced. Can you get an accent shade while writing slow? Yes, of course. If you were doing that second stroke of the P, you just add a little, that's a really weird shape, but you just shade just a little bit. You just press just a little bit. When you're going slow, that presses, it's gonna be your fingers, and you just shade just a little bit as you're traveling through. Yeah, looking at it now, this in my brain made sense, but that looks completely terrible. Don't do that with the ascended L after the P. But like I said, I wouldn't use one of these entry ovals that has more stuff here, because then it creates these hot spots in here, and it's even more madness. Which is why they probably often used the variation like this guy here. Because when you do this, you have a lot more stuff to the left side. So your L can be tucked in nice and close and nothing gets in the way of it whatsoever. Because that P doesn't hang over a lot. The other variation is using an ascended stroke, similar, sort of, to what we did with the J. Yes, controlling the shade, that's the name of the game. Gotta be able to control it both fast and slow. Manipulate those tines. So with the ascended shade, like a P, ascended shade, that's not what it's called. I don't actually remember what it's called. It can start with a horizontal entry oval as well. When we get here, I come down on the slant line. I don't like to... This can be done on the baseline. I like to drop it a little bit below the baseline. And then this could either finish like so. If I was going to add a shade, it would fit right between there and there. You could do like so. Or you could bring that down. Come all the way around. Like so. With this one, with this variation, there is a possibility, again, if you have an L coming after, you want to... I wouldn't use this variation if I had an L because it would get in here, but I don't see as big of an issue if you have letters coming in and this oval, if it was a little more horizontal and cut through there, it potentially wouldn't bug me as much as that first one. But I wouldn't probably use that variation if I had an ascended stroke come after it. This is a really pretty variation of the P. It's been very popular online to do it with a like so, like how Palmer did it, having that stroke cut across, adding a small little accent, just a little tick there, and then compound curve into your oval downstroke. I personally like to do it with the variation where we come down, whoops, we come down, I do a tiny little oval, and then this could go either into the P with a slight little accent shade here, or we could do what we had in this variation. We had the little oval, we come up here, small little tick to do a compound curve to meet up with that stroke there. That's the P that I've been utilizing quite a bit lately, I feel like. Just because it's fun to have that little tick in there. And again, this can sit on the baseline or below the baseline. If it is below the baseline, just slightly below the baseline. As an example, wait, I believe PZ Blozer writes below the baseline in his cover. Oh, he goes way below the baseline. So on the cover of Lessons in Ornamental Penmanship, you can see here, PZ Blozer, it's fuzzy, but that's okay, dropped way below the baseline, almost as far down as he did on the capital Z. And he went high up, drop below, up, a larger version of that first example I put here, oval into, and then he used the what will be the second stroke as the stem for the next letter, which is kind of neat. Very designy. Good night, Marilyn. Thanks for hanging out. So that is the P. There's lots of variations of the P. I think one of the most beautiful ones. See you next week. The variation of the P that I like the most is... I don't use it as often, but I feel like it looks delicate and very beautiful. Is the compound curve into the horizontal shade, or into the stem shade, and then coming around. Ugh. What's going on? Come over here a little closer. I'm getting bad shape on this oval. Why can't I do a nice P today? Come on, arm. What's going on here? The biggest issue I have with this one is keeping the shade low enough. And then the issue I'm having now is getting this really sharp horizontal oval on top instead of a nice rounded stroke. Those are better. A little bit. Does this also have a bulge? I mean, yes, a little bit, because it follows that same compound curve. If you were to do it on the slant line, it's going to look too angled in the end. So you want it to have that compound curve, so it is going to bulge a little bit out to the right for that shade. Okay. Let's go into P, B, and R. We're going to do R next. So the capital R, all of the variations that we did for the P starting, all work for the R. They're virtually the exact same letter. It's just when you end the P, you keep going for the R. So, like we had our horizontal entry oval, regardless of if we have a stem. Then we come here. We have a P. Now, to make it into an R, we just keep going. I like to have the little loop on the R, same angle, that opposite angle that we had on the capital E that we started with. We have a little oval that gets bisected by our stem stroke here into a compound curve and finishes with a oval that bisects the baseline. Now, I will say, when I started writing, the variation or what I strive for today is different than what I used to with the capital R. And that was with the shape of, let me just draw a couple more here. So, from this part is all the same. I used to extend this compound curve out so it traveled at an angle, like you would imagine, like a Roman R does. The last stroke comes down at an angle. And then goes out like that. Maybe that's a little bit too out. But something like that, maybe. Whereas now, one of my go-tos is to try to get this downstroke on the slant line almost before it curves into that exit oval. I have seen both of them in writing. This one is, I would say, a little more traditional. But I wouldn't say that either is incorrect. So the beginning is the same. We come across here. Now we transition out of this little oval down almost on our slant line and then come out. Now we run the risk then of it looking like it's going to tip over, similar to how the P often ends up looking like it's going to tip over. But there's just a part of me that likes the way that one looks better. It was, I think, examples by CC Kanan that drew me to it and made me fall in love with that variation. like so. I like to do a tiny little, just a little plop, similar to the ending of the M, a little shade on the base there. Oftentimes you'll see, kind of like an octopus, yeah. You'll sometimes see this top part shaded and the bottom part not shaded, bottom part shaded, top part not shaded. It's rare to see both of them shaded because then the whole letter just looks really, really heavy. But the same sort of idea applies when we talked about the P, how you can have our entry, how you can have a tiny little oval inside here. That can go around like that. Or it can go and do an extra loop. Like that one. Whoa, way too big of an exit oval there. It should be more similar to what we got going on in the entry. It is, I think, a matter of personal preference how low this starts or how low this drops. I think a lot of the old specimens, some days it looks almost like it looked like a challenge to see how low they could drop it, because sometimes that entry stroke would go around, drop so low and come up, and then basically almost retrace before that shade. Sometimes. Let me see what PZ Blozer's got going on in here. Not a huge fan of his stem shades, if I'm being honest. But as an example, I want to see if he does what I'm talking about. Yeah. His is a little angled, but you can see how low that drops down to the baseline and then comes up almost on the same angle as a slant line, so it's almost a retrace on the way down. The one bonus when you get that dropped a lot lower, and again, I wouldn't consider either way right or wrong, but the difference between, or a difference visually, between a narrow one and one that drops low, when you have the second stroke, you can get both of those oval or both of those hairlines inside your tiny little opposite angle oval, versus on the first one you can only get the one. Like so. Yeah. All right, so that is the art. The same, that classic, traditional, continuous example. This started with the compound curve. Can come around here. Whoa. Like so. Let me do another one of those. There we go. You can have that one the same as the P. And again, with that one, or I don't shade the top oval of my R's very often. I just like the way it looks. They are a little bottom heavy, but I like with the two bottom shades on it. Have a good evening. Till next week. Thanks for hanging out. Or you could also use the like so. Now, the big difference between the P and the R here, the R and the B can drop below the baseline. I don't see any reason why they can't, but I don't believe in my studies looking through archives and whatnot. I can't remember seeing an example of a vintage traditional B or R that dropped below the baseline. It seemed like traditionally they only really dropped the P below the baseline. When I got into Spencerian and ornamental penmanship, I always dropped the B and the R below the baseline because that's how Mike Saul does it. I don't know if he picked it up somewhere or if he just did it because he likes the way it looks. I still do it because I like the way it looks. It's a personal choice. I've never seen a rule that says it shouldn't drop below the baseline or that it should. I think it can. I think it looks good when it drops below the baseline. Primarily because this to me can look a little bit stunted. Whereas if that stem can drop a little bit below, it frees it up a little bit. Just a little below the baseline, not like PZ Blowzer Signature where it dives way deep below the baseline, but just a little bit. Let me do ideally, this should be up here a little bit higher so that that little loop doesn't get in the way of our little oval getting close to the stem. That B ends up being a little too wide. Or R, sorry. So it can. That's probably a little bit too far below the baseline. It's ornamental penmanship, so it's the realm of what you think looks good. I apologize that my forms are a little inconsistent today. Whose variation is the continuous P? I was used a lot. Do you mean like this one? I don't know if that's a specific person. Most of the variations aren't specific people that use them. A lot of the Zanarians used this variation of the P. I don't know if Zaner was one of the first people, or I wouldn't attach it to one person. All right. Now we go into the B. This is a gnarly looking nib right now. I can see right through. Tines aren't closing, but that's okay. With the B, I'll do B, and then if you have any questions about the P or the R that I didn't touch on, that P is in the new standards, but yeah, like it was an old variation, or it was used a lot. It was just a standard variation. All right, for the B, come in. The B is the one letter where, or of these three, I don't bring the B in that close to the stem. The opposite angled loop on the B sits out farther to the right than with the P and the R. Like so. It doesn't tuck in. If I did, and I'll do one so you can see why. If I were to bring this like I did the B and the R, to get a shade in there and to have that tuck all the way in, it very much ends up now looking super skinny on the bottom, and it feels like it's going to tip over. Because unlike the R, it doesn't have this horizontal exit oval to sort of support it on the right hand side. And when you're crossing here, to get all the way this way, in order to get far enough out to get your shade, this would have to go way up and out, and that would make this oval super big on the inside. So we get that second stroke, we let it extend out a little bit more. Like so. Yeah, the B has to be fatter. So the stem is far away from those, from that little loop. That's, I would say, the biggest difference between the B, the P, and the R. Or between the B and the other two. One other thing to note. The first B is very weird to you. This one? I mean, this should be a little bit closer. The B, ideally... Fiber. Note to self. Buy more paper towel this week. You are running out. So if we have a stem, and then we start to be here. Like so. So the B can start here, or it can start on this side. Up to you, personal preference. I've seen it both ways. You end up having little space for the second loop. Yeah. Well, and that's where a big difference between what I would consider a more sort of modern, not modern penmanship, but modern style of ornamental penmanship B versus a traditional penmanship B. The first oval on, if we're just talking about our second stroke here, it's the difference between this where, just like the capital E, both of these ovals are slanted on the 48-degree slant line. Whereas in a more traditional B, that first oval takes on, similar to what we did with the P, how we kind of squished it. What's going on, Catherine? We kind of squished it so that it was still angled, but it was a little more on the horizontal side. Traditionally, you'll see the B take on this very horizontal entry. So the first oval, once we get to this point, they're the same, but this part here is much more horizontal, and this one is angled. And now, I will admit, for years, I was not a fan of this was overhanging a little bit too far to the right, but I was not a fan of that style of B, and you can see that's how, for example, that's PZ Blozer's B. Just like how we discussed with the P, it goes here, curves up, like it's making this large implied oval, but it curves up, curves into this horizontal little oval, and then we have an angled oval on the bottom, then transitioning again to a horizontal oval to finish. I rebelled against doing that for a long time. I was very much a fan of having both on an angle. I think both styles of the B look good, but I will say that now I do use the more traditional style. I don't know the specific reason for having the first one horizontal. But like the first B that I ever tried to get good at was Michael Saul's variation. Like so. But now I like it to have that more horizontal first oval than the other way. Yep. And then often, like, in my brain, I don't think of this oval needing to be completely 100% horizontal. It's similar to the P, how we wrote the P, how it ends horizontal, but it starts, just like how PZ Blozer did it as well. It starts coming up this way, angled, and then it tucks in at the end. So it ends up, the second half of that stroke is what makes it seem horizontal, but the first half is much more angly, if that makes sense. The backwards B? What is the backwards B? Backwards B. I don't know a backwards B. I do the same variations that we did for the P and the R, are my standard go-tos for this variation of the B. Like so. Ovals are all over the place, but that's okay. Yeah, I can do a Z next. You could also do how we had that, the descended B, or with the stroke that goes below the baseline. Like so. That again is probably a little bit too far below the baseline. I would just want to drop it ever so slightly below or on the baseline. The continuous B. Whoa. So maybe the continuous one shouldn't be a B. If it was gonna be a B, it would have to go not crossed over like I did here. It would have more space. Like that. I don't know that I've ever written the B that way before. Sorry, Fozzie, that I don't know what the backwards B is. I apologize. Backwards B, I'm trying to imagine. Nope, I don't know the backwards B. That little variation of that weird version of the P that we talked about, you can also do with the B. Like so. Gives a little bit of flair. So there are lots of, basically anything we did with the P, you can also do with the B and the R. One of the craziest Bs. Whoa. No, wait, that's not what I wanted to do. I'll do it. I'll continue anyways. This is one of my go-to Bs. Already did it once. Or there's the Crazy Michael Saul B. That one. Let me write that one again. Like so. My forms are kind of banana pants today. Sorry. I haven't been doing a whole lot of writing this week. It's been still move, stress, still boxes everywhere. Trying to organize life. Yeah, that's the B, P, and the R. If there's any questions about those, or if I didn't touch on something you would like me to elaborate on a little bit more, please let me know, and I will. Now you guys want to see, what do we say, we do the capital Z next. So the capital Z, one of the first things to remember when you do a capital Z, because we've done, before you get to Z, we're so used to doing stem strokes and stem shades, where we have the shade coming down and getting our stem like that. That we have, like this would be for the M, for the N. We have this stem shade, this same shade on all the B's and whatnot that we've done already. But for the Z, we have the opposite shade that goes on the O. Whereas instead of shading only the bottom half of that line that comes down from the slant line, for the O, we have our O here. Come on. Right. I don't know if this is the paper, the ink, or the nib that's giving me trouble today. But it is definitely giving me trouble. So like so, where we have the thickest point is right in the middle here. And we're tapering from this top point all the way to this bottom point. Nice and even taper. It's not heavier on the bottom, it's not heavier on the top. What's going on, Daniel? Argentina. Nice. Welcome. We are breaking down capital letters today. And listening to some chill music. I guess this song's not super chill. Kind of chill. So that's the shade you would put on the O. We do the flip that upside down, and that's the shade we have on the Z. So, thickest point right here. Even taper. There. Unlike here, where we don't start the shade until this point here, we have that hairline at the top portion. We start shading right away. So far, if you notice, this is very similar in motion-wise to the capital A and the capital J that we did. Unlike the A and the J, they came up on this curve, same curve, but then they kept going and went down on the slant line in almost a straight line. The Z continues like an oval. We keep that ovoid shape as we come around and get that nice even tapered shade on the right-hand side. Now you can lift, just like I said when we were doing the L. You can lift when you hit that baseline. We can come here. What is going on every time I get ink? Stop it. so you can lift. Now, one thing to remember or to consider with the Z, because we're not hitting flat along the baseline here, like we do with our stem shade, we're still traveling down at an angle because we're doing that oval shade. Just like here, we're not flat along the baseline, we're coming down. Our traffic is still coming down. You've got to be kidding me. My nibs hate me today. When we get to this bottom bit, whether you lift or whether you don't, we have a tiny little loop, and then we go up and down to do our descended stroke. Like so. Now, unlike the L, which comes down with that compound curve, and has the horizontal little oval that's along the baseline, this little oval is slanted. It is not flat. It is sometimes seen written flat, but it is supposed to be slightly angled because it's coming down at an angle. It goes back up on that angle and then down. So if you imagine, write one slow here, coming up and around, like so. And the bottom can have a shade. It doesn't need to have a shade. I think nod shaded is very delicate and beautiful. That being said, I often shade the bottom part. And this oval can be small, narrow. It's a tiny little thing, but the main thing to remember is that you want it to be slanted, not flat along the baseline. That being said, it often ends up being flat along the baseline sometimes, even if you intend it to be slanted. But that is, yeah. So what they would do, oftentimes they would lift. So they would start the Z. Whoa. What is happening? One more try. They would lift. Notice it's coming down. They would pick their pen up here and continue. Like so. Similar to the L, I can always see where the lift is when I do it that way. Many people can do it that way. I personally am not one of them, so I like to continue and just keep going. It keeps the flow. Also, you can see the angle of this oval and of this descender are different, whereas if I do them all together, they end up matching each other a little bit better usually. The one issue that happens is that little oval is sometimes not as big as I would like it to be. Something that needs work. So either or, lifted or not. Not great forms today. My apologies. The Z can start with the compound curve stroke that we used to start the... When did we use it earlier today? We used it for the I that we did. It can start with a little compound curve. Like so. Also notice, I should note, I'm compound curving these out. Normally this would finish on an overturn and just end right here or go into another flourish. Because there's no lowercase letters that come after it, that's why I'm doing a compound curve out. Normally they wouldn't really have a compound curve there at the end. They would just finish more like this. Totally didn't do a little a little loop at all on that one. What about that loop in the B and the P? Is that horizontal or slanted? For the B and the P, ideally, again, you'll see them flat sometimes. Ideally for me, I try to get that that little loop to be opposite of the 48-degree slant line, so slanted. You'll see on many of my Bs here, a lot of them are flat. And flat's not a bad thing, but I would like them to be a little bit higher or a little bit more slanted. Slanted is the goal. So for the B, you've got to be joking. There we go. That's a better second stroke. Nice and slanted there. Did you ever use a similar capital Z in a signature, but as an ending letter? I'm not exactly sure what you mean. Oh, do you mean... Yeah, I don't know exactly what you mean. Do you mean just with no lowercase letters, like first name and then just ending in this Z, not a last name, but just like an initial, just using the capital Z on the end? All right, what else about the capital Z? It's basically it. It's a pretty standard letter. The only real things that you add or take away from the Z are the entry stroke, similar to what we did with the first E. The entry stroke can be schnazified, and the exit stroke can be schnazified, so long as the form of the letter itself maintains maintains its structure. I never have, Nico. I'm trying to think. No, like if the last name ends in a Z, I've never finished one that way. It would be, I mean, it would be a convenient finish because finishing a signature with an initial would be great because it helps the balance. It's one of the hardest parts about signatures and designing is because you have this fancy capital that starts it off and then it ends in a lowercase letter. So you have to add flourishes at the end to make it balance a little bit more. What about the R loop? Yeah, I would say the R and the B, I would try to get both of those slanted. I think naturally my R is a little more slanted because it's tucked in closer to the baseline or to the stem stroke. When I do an R here, because I have it in my brain that I'm trying to thread this, it naturally wants to go on that angle, and because it's finishing in a downward compound curve, that helps tip it up. Whereas with the B, what ends up happening as you come here, because it doesn't tuck in, the shade almost comes up to go into the B, which is why they end up flatter more often than not. But I try to get it to come up and still have that same space, which just means I need to not let it get too far to the left before I get that curve in there. That sounded a lot more confusing than it should have. I apologize. Ah, with Gomez. Yeah, you could do that. What I would do with that, if I was going to end with the capital Z, if you wanted it that way, depending, let me see. Oh, and then into the capital. Now, there's where one issue comes into play, is connecting into the capital. Because the Z is a indirect oval letter, it's not the most natural to get into. Like if we were going into a capital A or something, it'd be really easy to drop low and get into that direct oval motion to get into a capital A or another G or something like that. But we have to somehow reverse angle for the Z. Which is possible. You just have to get a clever way to get into that. And I don't know how I would do that right now. Sorry, I'm talking a lot and I'm probably not being the most, or explaining things the most eloquent I can. My classes are more thorough than this, I promise. Or at least more put together in their thought process. Who's banging? Somebody's banging upstairs. Okay, yeah. Nico, I don't know how I would get into this set. I have to think about that offline. Oh, but that is the Z. The Z can start, like I said, it can start with a compound curve. Like so. It could finish with an extra, with an extra little oval on the end. But there's nothing really that gets added, or there's no little variations with the base form itself. It's basically just an upside down capital E, essentially. You have your entry, your top oval, your bottom oval coming around. Both on the same slant line. The compound curve entry, in my opinion, makes all the capitals feel a lot more natural to write and makes them beautiful. All right. What letter would we like to do next? Or are we done? What do we think? There's a lot of people in here, but not a lot of people are chatting today. I like to believe that's because everybody's practicing and trying to work along with me. D, capital D, my nemesis. Yeah, I'll do the capital D and then we'll do the capital G. Me and the capital D are not always friends. Oops. Spilling ink on my desk. So the capital D, the variation that I like to use the most, I start with a horizontal oval. horizontal oval. Then I come down along the slant line, no shade yet at all. I like to drop this ever so slightly below the baseline. I come down at a straight line, I hook down below the baseline. Now I go into a compound curve that goes above the baseline onto the baseline. So it goes above, on, and then from here, just like we were doing a capital O, I start creating an oval on the slant line. Like so. And then, like I explained with the capital O shade on the last page, we start our shade up at the top here. It finishes, now because we're transitioning into a exit horizontal oval, we want to finish at the base of this implied oval, which means the shade is tapered to a hairline before we hit the baseline. Thickest point of the shade is at our halfway point. So right here, we have a nice even taper from hairline and back to hairline. Not a problem. Mom duties come first. So this little oval can drop below the baseline or it can sit on the baseline. It can also go flat along the baseline. I personally don't usually like to write it that way. I like to keep it on a slanted oval. But like I said, it can drop. It can sit on the baseline like so. Our entry and exit ovals are approximately the same size. Similar to how we discussed at the very beginning with the capital E, they're about the same size as an O would be, like so. Just turned on its side there. As a general rule, I like to keep the stem of the D lower, and that's just so it doesn't interfere with the shade too much. Most of the other letters, if you were going to go into a stem, you could do entry oval, you come up above the halfway point and then come down. So you have a little bit of hairline before the shade starts. This could be a little bit longer. But with the D, I like to go to about the middle point, about halfway, instead of going all the way up. And the reason for that, I do one here that goes higher. As I come down, it's not bad, but because there's going to be a shade right here, it just feels naturally like I want this line to cut off right there. So this shade is the only thing up in this area. I don't have to worry about hitting that that hairline at all. We start with the horizontal oval. We have the downstroke and the compound curve. And there. We run into the biggest issue I have with the D, is keeping the shape that O shape and not making it too slanted. Doing some air ovals and a proper warm-up will always be helpful when you're doing the capital D. I mean, it'd be helpful for everything, but for me in particular, you could also, as you're practicing this, just start from that downstroke, Getting that all smooth in one stroke. Keeping your shade nice and high. Ideally, you want the shade to be back to a hairline like this before it hits the baseline. Or if it goes below the baseline, just a little bit below the baseline. We don't want the shade way down low. Oh, Fozzie's right. It's evil. There is a variation that's similar to the To Engrosser script. That's the one that starts with a ever so slight compound curve. Has the oval along the baseline. Comes up here. And shades like so. Or can come over here and do a double shade if you wanted it to, and then shade this one. I'm not very good at this one. There's another when I look at this, it's another one. I want that to be, I just like the look of that oval better when it's on a slant, personally. So that one again, slowly. You could go like so. Ugh. I don't do that variation of the T very often, and it shows. If you follow iCursive on Instagram, he was rocking these ones last week. They were looking really nice. He had them. I'm gonna pull up his account again. I did this last week. iCursive. Yeah. So he comes down around and keeps everything on the right hand side of the stem. I'm about to throw this nib out the window. Woo. Yikes. So, like my capital stems, I should start them much lower and they will look prettier. Oh, the backward B's in his book. I need to find this backwards B. Where is Michael So's book? All my books are unboxed, so I do have it here. This one? The little one? Or in his big book? I don't know where his big book is. Oh, it's up there. Okay. Backwards B, backwards B, backwards B. Looking for the backwards B. These all look normal. They're in the small one. Where? Sorry, I guess I can let you guys see what I'm looking at. Looking for a backwards B. I don't see it. Oh, this one. The backwards B. I've never done that B before. That's a very similar start. That's like the backwards D that we're doing right now. Similar letter form, yeah. Whoa. I don't think I have ever written that variation, ever. Obviously, I've seen it before because I read that book, but I have no memory of it. Maybe I saw it and X'd it out. Backwards letters are evil. Right, let's draw that one slowly first. So it's just a compound curve. I mean, that makes sense. That's a pretty B. That feels very weird doing that. Ugh. I feel like I'm just begging for my nib to snap all over the place on that upstroke. Ooh, that would take some control practice. Keeps those so tiny. Evil. That's why the sirens is the police. They're coming for this B and D variation. Oh, why does that feel so weird? That movement feels incredibly foreign. Like, the first one looks, when I did it slow, looks decent. I cannot. It's making it bigger and then smaller. The opposite effect is happening. Man. Oof. That would take a lot of practice. That is a... Yeah, we're just gonna move on from that one. Not my jam. But that's a cool variation of the B. Backwards B. That's gonna take some practice. It feels really weird doing that up this way with movement. I can draw it. But I cannot do that movement. No, that just gets very ugly looking. All right, we're gonna go back to the capital D here. Standard capital D. I'm not gonna review the letters that I'm not very good at because I'm making myself look horrible right now. I just lost 10 viewers in the past couple seconds when I started doing these Bs. So no more Bs. There's the D. Looking okay. Yeah, it's your fault, Fuzzy. Oh, they're gone. Some probably had to go to sleep. I'm assuming. For anybody who's not overseas, it is rather late. All right, somebody asked about any questions about the D specifically. I can break it down even if my hand doesn't want to do it all that well. The biggest thing is just getting the drill that would be very helpful for the D is this one. Getting those shades on the slant line. Lunchtime. This G has becoming one of my favorite letters lately to write. Please compare the shading and oval size difference of Spencerian and Engrosser's D. Oh, there's a huge difference versus the Spencerian and the Engrosser's D. I don't feel like that's something I'm going to get into tonight. The biggest difference there is that the ornamental penmanship variation of that D starts with, the way iCursive was doing it, there's no shade, but it's a compound curve. This is completely hairline. Ugh, that just doesn't look good. Whereas the Engrosser script one, you have your full-on shaded downstroke. Very not a nice D. So the biggest difference is really your compound curve shade, pretty much. All the flourishes that come after it, a lot of people that flourish with Engrosser script use a combination of angled and horizontal ovals. I personally am not a huge fan of the way Engrosser script is flourished most of the time. I like when it's flourished like ornamental penmanship, which is how I would do it, which makes the letters very, very much the same. Other than where the shade is on that initial stem stroke. And as far as oval size, the Engrosser script D is a funky letter. Like, the way it comes down goes way over to the right or to the left. Like the bowl is super tiny over here, whereas in the sort of Spencerian version, like the one that iCursive was doing, all of the oval is happening on the opposite side, unlike here where it's all on this side. Wherever this goes, this can go over there. In the Spencerian version, it's all happening on this side. But I don't use this version. I'm not good at this version, so I can't really discuss this variation of the D, because that looks like garbage. I don't know. I don't write it. So, not a good question for me to answer. I'm sorry. I'm not the best person to answer that one. All right. There's lots of variations. I don't know them. I'm sorry, I can't answer. I don't know. I don't use them. I use the one variation only. But it seems like that's about... If anybody has any other questions about other capital letters, doesn't seem like there's been any more coming in the past little while. I feel like we've touched on most of the breakdowns of the capital letters today. Sorry that the last two letters were pretty garbagey. Most of the evil ones, yeah. Oh, W. We can totally do the W. I like W's. So, standard W starts with overcurve, just indirect oval. Similar to if you were here when we did the capital I. But the difference is the W stays a little more rounded. Where the capital I came up. God, you've gotta come on. So the capital I came around and had a sharp downstroke or a sharp turn at the top. The W, it does come back straight, but it is not as sharp of a top, basically. It's coming up and over. And more gradual. So it still has that gradual implied oval shape to it, but when it hits here, this does, like at this point, we get into that stem shape. So we are straight. We're just not straight as long. The top of it stays rounded, unlike the I and the J. So we have our reverse oval, indirect oval, and we come down. Unlike the Z, where we have the shade all on this side, this is a stem shade. So we start the shade when we get about the halfway point and flat along the baseline, like so. This is the stroke number 1 that takes the most practice, this capital stem stroke for the W. Where the thickest point is right here in the middle of this shade area. Not like the Z, where we shaded top to bottom. That's one of the things I feel like I see most often going back and forth between these two letters. Then you drop your pen just to the right of about where the thickest point of the shade is. It doesn't have to be the exact thickest point, but about right there. And then we have essentially an ascended lowercase l. We have come up like this, down. The downstroke has a slight compound curve to it. Hits the baseline. It's slightly rounded at the baseline. So it was taught more often than not as a sharp point at the bottom, but with a very slight little curve at the bottom. Many people did it sharp, myself included. Many vintage specimens, you can tell they weren't trying to make it slightly round. A lot of times it was trying to be sharp. The second stroke of the W also had a lot of different variations. Some of them were this ascended looped stroke variation. Other ones were sharp on top and curved on the bottom. So we'll go over some of those now. Out of fiber. Get out of here. Napkin fiber. So, with that, ascended L, or lowercase l essentially, that little compound curve, it's almost too subtle to think about it being a compound curve. When you're coming down, I tend to think about making that downstroke straight along the slant line. And then it compounds just a little bit. It just seems to be like a natural flow that happens. So the difference between that one and that one. And the difference visually that you see, most of the time the compound curve is subtle enough that you don't notice it as a compound curve, but it changes the connection point and makes it a little bit higher and a little bit closer to the middle of the letter form, if that makes sense. If the loop pointy ascender goes over the capital stem, how far can it go? So you're saying, like, if my stem's here, how far can this go up here? Oops. Like, how tall can this part be, I think is what you're asking. Most of the time, they end up being about even or lower. Usually they don't go higher than the stem. Similar to the capital M. If you had your stem for the M right here, you wouldn't bring these end up cascading down as you're going. This is one of those do as I say, not as I do things. I personally, on the M specifically, I like my first M to be taller. Or it looks taller, but technically on the horizontal plane, they are the same size, but it's taller than it should be, technically. For the W, you don't see that as much. For the W, they look like they're about the same height along the horizontal plane as the stem. I wouldn't bring it much higher than that. You could. As an example, let's write one. Like, you can bring it up higher, but I would tend to try to keep it about that same height. Now you could also, there's the different variations of that ending stroke. Like I said, you could have the curve that goes sharp, which is what you end up seeing most of the time. That's probably, I guess, the easiest, not the easiest, that's the go-to. That's what you see most often. What was taught, and I think what they were striving for most of the time, was that same beginning with a very subtle curve on the bottom. That's what I've been striving for lately. That's been the goal. And the best way that I can think of what I'm thinking about when I'm doing that is not actually thinking about the curve at the bottom. I'm thinking about traveling to the right and doing stopping and going, but not letting my movement stop. And when I do that, but I keep my lateral movement going, it naturally rounds out that little bottom part. So I'm not actually thinking round, because when you do that, you end up with woo, with a really rounded bottom, and you want it to be barely rounded. Just, yeah, barely rounded at all. There's some really cool examples in the old scrapbooks that are like, it just comes up so close, but it's just rounded on the very bottom, and then so it's not a retrace, it just comes up right beside the hairline, and it looks really cool. The easiest W that you can do is sharp on top, straight down, and then ending overturn like so, which you can do that one. It's like an ending T. Or if I was going to do sharp on top, I would then try really hard to do rounded on the bottom. So I would do it sharp on the top, come down, round out the bottom, and over and out. Like that. That's how, when I first was really getting into the W, it was either I went round on top, pointy on the bottom, pointy on top, round on the bottom. Those were like my two choices. Now, since I've been trying to get this tiny little rounded bottom, I shoot for rounded on top, slightly rounded on the bottom. Is the goal. All right. That stem stroke, you can get into the stem of the W just like any of the other, stem entries we've done today. Come on. Overturn. It finishes, it can finish right here. You can cut that line off. Or it can continue into a horizontal exit oval. You want to get this oval, you don't want it to be too big. What's going on, Mom? Thanks for popping by. My mom was Zentangling this evening. You could also start the W with a compound curved entry, like so. And then finish it the same way, like that. Ending overturn like so. One of the biggest issues I have when I try to round out the bottom, you can see here that I don't always hit the baseline. That is one of the biggest issues. And that's just because of habit. It's something that I'm not super good at. Something that I'm working on. I have to remember to get my ascended stroke. What I think causes it is because when I do ascended lowercase letters, they get cut off. When you do an ascended lowercase, you stop about where it hits the entry stroke. And because we're starting above the baseline, my brain sort of sets this as my like invisible baseline. So I do my upstroke, my ascended top part, come down, and then that's where I end up finishing it rather than dropping down to the actual baseline. And that is something that I've been seeing quite a lot in my own work lately, which is needing to be fixed. All right. Trying to think of other variations of the W. The W can be done with what I would consider the standard stem shade as well. Capital stem. Not as common to see it done with a sharp turned one, but it can be done that way as well. I don't think it looks as good. I used one in my old, you can see in my own signature right here, I used one. It has a sharp turn and then down. It works in signatures. It ends up being a go-to for signatures, but if I can get into a W with a rounded entry, a rounded indirect oval entry, then I will. She's gone. She went to bed. She was only here for a second though. And that is essentially the W. I want to try to get a new sheet of paper, and I want to try to show some better examples of that compound curve. I want to try to do some large ones. Because like I said, I never really teach focusing on the compound downstroke. I like to think of it as just a straight downstroke into the exit oval, and then let the movement itself create the compound curve. If you're drawing slow, if you're going to write the letter slowly, then obviously you have to have that in mind before you go. But if I do a slow W, usually the compound curve is very, very, very subtle. Compound curve entry, yeah. I normally do a W with a compound curve entry. Like so. And I did bring that above. Maybe I do go, it's not super, this looks a lot higher than this just because of the space that's in here. But really, I mean, it is a little bit higher, but not a whole lot higher. And that's ideally what that's sort of like the go-to when I talk about the roundedness. It's just slightly rounded at the bottom, and then almost, just instead of retracing, it's just slightly over to the right. I need to have a good writing day on a Tuesday one day. They haven't been happening for me on Tuesdays as of late, unfortunately. I'll blame life stresses and whatnot. What are other variations of the W? Can I think of any? Oh, there's one that I don't use very often, so I'll probably get it wrong. One that sort of comes from no, that's not really how it starts. There is a W that starts with a direct turn oval like that, but I can't. No, pretend I didn't say that. I feel like Mataraz had one of those similar to the M that he uses. The ones that go. What is? Similar to the rounded M, there's a W version of that as well. Oh, thanks for hanging out, Nico. I hope you had fun. Good luck. Show me what you come up with that ending Z. I'll think about it when I'm offline and see if I can come up with something cool. Oh yeah, the H. All right, let's do H. Have we covered the W completely? Variations of the W... I can't think of many, to be honest. It's pretty standard with that stem. Let's go into H. There's lots of variations of the H. The one that I use the most these days starts with just a standard capital stem. And then I lift my pen and I do this as a downstroke. For a long time, I did it as an upstroke. I find it much easier as an upstroke, but I want to get the ability to do it as a downstroke. Coming from right to left. Coming down, and then a little at at the end. That is actually much better than normal. I usually throw that one as an upstroke because I get the path and the movement a little bit easier. But I would like to get in the habit of doing it as a downstroke. So that is the go-to H that I use most of the time. Sometimes you'll see this little loop. Cross over the stem. You gotta be careful with that though, because that's really wet ink, and sometimes you'll pull that wet ink into your letter. There is a version of that, I know, in Michael Saul's book. I don't know that I've ever used it. Where, well, this came up higher and then crossed there, so this still, and then it went like so into an exit stroke. I don't use that one just because I find that point quite hard to hit. But it's basically just a lower version of the first one that we did, so that we can have it go into a angled or a horizontal oval right there. If I want to end in an oval, I'll usually finish the opposite direction and do indirect oval. Like so. So I'll turn this into a tiny compound curve into an indirect oval along the baseline. That would normally be my go-to, I think. You could do a loopy or very compound curvy variation of the H, where you start into it either like we did with the first W or from a loop. The W can also be started from a loop stem like so. This, you could do the same H, finish it this way. Oh, that was way too close together, but you get the idea. Or instead of lifting here, you can continue compound curve into basically a C stroke. So if we were to do it like that with the shade on the left-hand side, it would look something like this. Like so, with the shade on the lower left side, that shade's a little high. Or how I would more naturally do this is not put the shade on the left, but shade the right-hand side like a capital C. Like so. If you can place your shades really well, you can hit a lower shade on the left side and an upper shade on the right side, which is much easier if you write slow than if you write fast. If you're going slowly and you're controlling where all your shade placement is, you can get like so, where you just have the shade on the left-hand side for the bottom and the right-hand side for the top, which is possible fast. I just don't know if it's possible today fast. I'll give it a shot. Form's a little off, but that's the idea. This one is like a C. Yeah, this second, essentially, if you take off the first half, you are left with basically a capital C. like so. You just have this going compound curve into your stem stroke instead. The biggest issue, or the biggest thing you have to make sure you remember, just like with the W, how this top portion is rounded, but it does have to hit that flat-ish slant line before it gets into the shade. It's sort of the same idea with the H. This can be rounded, but if this rounds too much this way, you're going to lose the shape of the H. You want it to continue to the right, and then not sharp like the I or the J, but you do want it to round out, sort of leaning in that direction, so we have this little bit of straight down along the slant line before we get the shaded baseline. If that makes sense. Yeah, so those are a couple of the variations of the H's. H versus X. So the way I like to do my X's, if I was going to do this variation, there's an X that's very similar to this. I would shade just this right-hand side or the left-hand side and not the C side, and I would just touch it in. So if you were doing an X, sort of like so. And you could do the opposite as well. You could keep the left-hand side unshaded. And shade the right-hand side. I personally think that ends up looking a little bit too heavy on the upper right side. And also when you have the shade, it seems to be a lot more difficult to hit that perfect point in the middle, because you get what happens here. We have the ink then pooling in to this hairline on both sides. Whereas if we have the hairline touching with the other variation, if I were to do it with a large shade, like if I had a big shade down there, my hairline is touching this other hairline before it gets into the shade. And then finishing. So that's one variation of the X. Another one that looks really pretty is just doing, and I think I probably like it better than this variation. It has a standard stem, just like the first W we did. Shade's a little high. Wait a minute. Let me round out that left side a little bit more. My shape got a little wonky, but that's the idea. So you have your shade on your right-hand side, and it could also start the way this one started. It's just finishing in a stem, and then you're doing, it can either start just from a straight line, or you can have a tiny little loop. Into similar, like doing a C on the right-hand side. You could do this one with the two shades as well, but risky because they're both meeting in that same point, and it means your shade's going to end up looking like this. Which could work, but is risky. It's a dangerous maneuver. This is, I mean, that's probably my favorite X variation, I would say. I think it's the cleanest looking. Basically like that. Evil X. I'm not doing an Evil X. I'm done with evil letters. What's the Evil X? There a crazy X in Mike's book? Oh, he doesn't have an Evil X. Just standard ones. Yeah, hardest part about the X is really hitting that middle point. They end up looking like H's, or H's end up looking like X's if you're not careful. Yeah. My tea's cold. Still delicious, but cold. All right. Ladies and gentlemen, I think that's about it. It seems like we've answered most of the questions that people had with the capital letters they were having trouble with today. Hopefully this stream helped some people with capital letters and didn't just add to the confusion. This ended up being, in my brain, it was a little more class-ish with practicing each ones every time. Then I just kept going from letter to letter and getting into the breakdown. So if you want to practice these over and over again, pause the YouTube video, replay certain parts if you want to get into it. Maybe we'll do a actual practice session one of these days of some of these capitals where we just repeat them over and over and over again. But yeah, that's about it. We're gonna call that an end to our capital letter breakdown late night live number 13. Hope you guys had a good time. I had fun. Yeah, I hope everybody's safe out there, keeping busy, and I look forward to seeing you guys again next Tuesday, if not sooner. Maybe I'll do some Instagram live origami or something this week if I get all these boxes put away. But yeah, thanks a lot for hanging out, everybody. I hope you had a great time. This has been fun. See you next week, and I'll see you online. Where's the page where I go to end the stream? There it is. I found it. Bye, everybody.